recording?
The recording has started.
Very good. Thank you, Megan. Thank you, Greg, so much for that introduction. And we are very excited for today as well, because we have a fantastic speaker joining us to talk about an incredibly important topic, and that is the relation of China to North America, and in particular, how this is seen from a Mexican perspective. Our speaker today is one of the most distinguished members of Mexico's Foreign Service, Ambassador Julian Ventura, who has been a career diplomat currently on leave, and in his 30-plus years in public service, he has held many of the most senior and most relevant to this topic positions that one could have held. Those include recently a post as the Deputy Foreign Secretary. Previously, he's been an undersecretary for North America, and he has been Mexico's ambassador to a variety of different places, including China, which he'll be speaking about today, including to the United Kingdom, where I'm located today, and he has been Deputy Chief of Mission in the United States as well. He has an extensive resume that I won't go too much more into, just to flag that Ambassador Ventura is someone with a wealth of experience, widely recognized as one of the sagest observers of both the North American project and Mexico's role in the world. So with that, I'll turn things over. Ambassador Ventura, Julian, it's a real pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us in the series today.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you, Tom, for the introduction. It's great to see some familiar faces this morning. It's a pleasure to join you to share, well, some thoughts on Mexico-China relations and their evolution. It's certainly timely to have this conversation now against the backdrop of the geopolitical shifts that you are all familiar with, global and North American economic trends, which is an important dimension. And as only happens once every 12 years, elections in both Mexico next June and in November in the US, with all the noise and uncertainty that they entail. I'll structure my remarks as concisely as possible to have time for questions. First, I'll give you a little bit of historical context on the relationship. I think it's important to look back to understand what's going on right now, followed by a snapshot of the current characteristics of the dynamics. And finally, a look ahead, taking into account current trends and their implications. I will highlight what's happening on the economic front. A lot of that is in the news. Also, the issue, for example, of fentanyl, which is cropping up in a very significant way in the three countries' relationships, and the implications of everything that's going on for US-Mexico relations in this geopolitical and bilateral context. So we have had half a century of diplomatic relations between Mexico and China, following China's, the vote in the UN General Assembly in February of 1971 that gave the People's Republic of China the seat in the United Nations, held until then by the Republic of China, Taipei, at that time. And Mexico was one of the first countries to do so. Now, this is important because the foundations were laid to what is a very fluid political dialogue that has been helpful at various points in the relationship to weather recurrent frictions and storms. But mostly during the first decade, the relationship was fundamentally centered on, third world solidarity in the context of the Cold War, interaction in multilateral fora. It was in many ways a formal relationship with little skin in the game, little in terms of substance, beyond third world solidarity and these dialogue in the international multilateral framework. It's also important to keep in mind that each country, China and Mexico, within its respective context and distinguishing features, Both China and Mexico were closed economies with no external drivers of economic growth and development, and basically defensive international outlook. Dynamics began to change dramatically in the 1980s with the reforms and opening up of the Chinese economy under the leadership of Deng Xiaoping. In Mexico, successive economic and financial crises led to changes in its state-led, oil-driven growth model toward our accession to the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the GATT, in 1986, and eventually to 1994's North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, followed by a significant insertion into the global economy through one of the largest global networks of free trade agreements, now with 50 plus countries, including in the Asia Pacific, with FTAs with Japan, and of course, the Trans-Pacific Partnership that the US withdrew from after President Donald Trump's election. This is important to keep in mind because in many ways, Mexico set off after demonstrating in a way that it was possible to negotiate this kind of far-reaching agreement with the world's largest economy, that it was possible from an asymmetric position to negotiate with the US, and it kind of detonated the race for new creative free trade agreements that we saw, particularly in Asia, but also in other places around the world. On the Chinese side, its significant transformations, including the establishment of diplomatic relations with the US in 1979, intensive engagement in international organizations, and most importantly, its accession in 2001 to the GATT's successor, the WTO, the World Trade Organization, dramatically altered, as we all know, its global economic footprint, sustained by an amazing, far-reaching transformation of its development model and external trade outreach, which changed global trade patterns dramatically. Now, by the time that China undertook negotiations to join the WTO, Mexico had already consolidated its position as a highly integrated part of the North American market through NAFTA and as an open manufacturing-led economy, reliant on foreign investment flows, particularly from the United States. Up until then, it was easy to manage relations with China through a consistent diplomatic dialogue in Beijing and Mexico City and the UN, and through a modest network of agreements centered on educational exchanges, culture, and some technical cooperation. As I said before, there was really no specific national interest, no skin in the game involved affecting Mexico in its management of the relationship with China. So we were keenly aware of the implications of China's accession to the WTO, both in terms of its potential impact in our own domestic market, particularly in our most inefficient basic manufacturing sectors, textiles, plastic, toys, footwear, and for the increased competition it would bring about in its main export destination, the US. So for the first time, strategic national interests were at stake. Some of you will, of course, probably remember the intense debates and media coverage around President Clinton's decision to conclude its WTO accession agreement with China. What many of you might not know is that Mexico was the last country to conclude its accession agreement with Beijing. It was an incredibly tough negotiation concluded during Ernesto Zedillo's administration. It included tariff protections and significant transition periods designed to give Mexico room to maneuver and adapt to China's entry into the global economy. This dynamic significantly strained the relationship, threatening to derail it at various points. In fact, the Chinese government refused to sign with President Zedillo. The negotiation was concluded during his administration and held out until the beginning of the Vicente Fox administration in 2001. This was the first example of how the political capital invested by Mexico in relations with Beijing since the 70s, together with China's long-term strategic views, paid off, enabling Mexico to effectively manage tensions and avoid a head-on collision with an emerging global power, which, by the way, in a relatively short period, as predicted, overtook us in terms of sources of exports to the US and displaced traditional Mexican manufacturers from the domestic market who hadn't adapted to increased competition on their home turf. So among the lessons learned from the WTO negotiation was the need to develop bilateral dialogue mechanisms through which to manage the relationship. The Chinese at that time favored ad hoc approaches. So Mexico took the initiative in 2003. I was the lead negotiator then as the Director General for Asia Pacific Affairs in the Mexican Foreign Ministry, taking advantage of visits by Premier Wen Jiabao and President Hu Jintao to negotiate a high-level bilateral commission similar to the one we had developed with the US before. It was the first of its kind, and it was used as a template for engagement with other countries, including with the US. I made a couple of trips to Washington to brief our friends in the State Department as to how we had negotiated this new mode of engagement with China, for example, and did so also with other European and Latin American partners. So from that binational commission at the ministerial level, we developed a more sophisticated infrastructure that matured gradually to account for an increasingly complex relationship. Differences in breadth and scope notwithstanding, engagement with the US and Europe and China, between the US, Europe, and China, took similar pathways, with common features being market access issues, private sector dialogues, investment discussions, and a more interest-based multilateral dialogue. We know, for example, that China has a big footprint and engagement in the UN framework, and a specific example was what we needed to do, what Mexico needed to do when it hosted the climate change conference in 2010 in Cancun, the 2010 COP. Coming 1 year after the failure of the previous conference in Copenhagen, you might remember the pictures of President Obama in his first global summit, huddled with Premier Singh, with Hu Jintao and Lula in the back rooms of Copenhagen. There was no agreement. The conference ended very acrimoniously. So Mexico had to invest significant diplomatic capital to make sure that the Cancun conference would not blow up. So it was the first example how you needed to balance your bilateral concerns with constructive engagement with a big multilateral player. Now, although beyond the initial rapprochement during President Obama's and President Xi's first term, increasing competition and bipartisan consensus in Washington became key features of the US-China relationship, culminating in President Trump's more aggressive pushback on the economic front, including through tariffs, and as was the case with Mexico, the suspension of most bilateral dialogue mechanisms. You will know, those of you who are familiar with the US-Mexico relationship, that most bilateral and North American mechanisms did not meet during the Trump administration. So we didn't have institutional basis for dialogue with China, and that had an impact, for example, in the US on very vital dialogues that had been developed on fentanyl and precursors at that time. I was appointed the ambassador in China after a stint as the Undersecretary for North America at the beginning of Xi Jinping's first term, a very different Xi Jinping in some ways than the one who is now starting his third term. There was a lot of optimism. The first country that Xi Jinping visited after assuming the leadership of the Communist Party and the government were precisely Mexico and the US. He had the Sunnyland Summit with Obama in Palm Springs, and he came to Mexico as well for a state visit. So what is the current state of play? We have continuity on trade and tariff policies, sustained by this very solid bipartisan consensus on China in Congress in the United States, and the normalization, the post-Trump normalization of government engagement that led to last November Xi Jinping Biden summit in San Francisco. Now, quick run through the key features of the relationship, Mexico-China relationship. It's our second largest trading partner. We trade a little bit more than $10 billion a year. It's our third export destination, $100 million in exports in 22-23. Our export profile includes manufacturers and increasingly agri-food exports. There was significant negotiations during the Peña Nieto and first term of Xi Jinping to significantly enhance market access to major agricultural exports to China, which is a feature that is familiar to you as well in terms of the profile of US-China trade, but also in our case, of course, including significant manufacturing exports from Mexico to China. Direct air connectivity, we had before the pandemic, direct flights to Mexico from Beijing, from Shanghai, and from Guangzhou. Those are gradually being reestablished after the pandemic. A first flight will start in April between southern China and Mexico. Beijing is slated to be next, just as, of course, the US is also enhancing its air connectivity with China after the Xi-Biden conversations in San Francisco. It's important to keep in mind that when it comes to economic relations with Beijing, Mexico is not Latin America. China is the top trading partner of most South American countries. Trade is commodity-based. Chinese investment is significant in South America, not at the top of the list because US and European investment is way ahead of Chinese investment, even in South America. It's centered on logistics.
If the boy gets in the house, call the police.
If I could remind everyone to make sure their microphones are muted, please. Thank you. Sorry about that, Julian.
Thank you. Chinese investment in Latin America is centered in South America on logistics and infrastructure, as you know, both within and outside the framework of the Belt and Road Initiative, which just celebrated its 10th anniversary. China's investment footprint in Mexico is small. It's manufacturing based. It's small, but growing consistently, but not even in the top 10 right now. And I invite you to look at the Inter-American Dialogue's recent report on Chinese investment in Latin America. And most recently, of course, there has been pandemic and hurricane solidarity. A major hurricane struck Acapulco late last year, and there has been significant cooperation on those two fronts. Where are we now? And this is where I want to focus most of my remarks, prefaced by this difference between China's footprint in Mexico and China's footprint in the rest of Latin America. It's important to note that this North American transformation has had a significant impact in Mexico's economic profile. Mexico accounts for around 3/4 of all of Latin America's manufacturing exports. We're not a commodity exporter like most of our South American partners. If you travel to Brazil, you will often see, not even in the business pages, but a small square in the front pages of Brazilian newspapers, which highlight, for example, the price of soybeans, which is the major export of Brazil to China, very asymmetrical relationships. They grew significantly during the commodity boom that we had several years ago. China's investment in Mexico, as I said, is more manufacturing centered and linked to those sectors that are the most dynamic sectors of the North American economy, particularly electronic goods, everything from appliances to other type of electronics, and of course the auto parts sector. It's a highly integrated global market, and I will retake that when we talk about the current challenges. But as BMW grows its footprint in Mexico, and as GM grows its footprint in Mexico, or Volkswagen, their big Chinese suppliers tend to look at investments in the Mexican ecosystem, which changed somewhat after the renegotiation of NAFTA during the Trump administration, with significantly stricter rules of origin provisions to stimulate investment, not only to the U.S., of course, which is the main objective of the U.S. negotiators, but also to the North American market. So when we see, for example, nearshoring trends that are taking place right now, a lot of that dates back to the conclusion of the USMCA negotiation, and not only related to China, but major global economies, companies in boardrooms in Europe, in South Korea, in Japan, in Southeast Asia, were had a wait and see attitude to see how Canada and Mexico would face the challenge, the significant challenge of negotiating with the Trump administration. And after the agreement was concluded, together with the realization that there was really no appetite in Washington, at least in the short and medium term, I think it's longer than that, given what we're hearing in the elections, for ambitious trade negotiations that entail a greater market access to the US market, that really investing in the North American market through productive investment was going to be the only game in town, the only way to really have a bigger foothold in the North American market. Now, as the global economy has recovered, and particularly the US economy, and we're seeing that as part of the electoral discourse coming out, especially from the White House, with some very strong economic recovery numbers, Mexico's highly integrated exports have risen, particularly to the United States, as have imports from China. We are now the US's top trading partner, ahead of Canada and China, due to various reasons, ranging from China-US dynamics to post-pandemic nearshoring trends. Last year, we exported almost $470 billion to the US. Contrast that with our $9 billion, $9 billion in imports from China, and we imported from the US a little bit over $300 billion. It's important to keep in mind, as we look at, for example, the current political debate in Washington, that capital or intermediate goods that are used in Mexico's manufacturing process have always been a feature of our import profile with China. They have oscillated between 70 and 75% of the total for at least the last 15 years. So it's again a highly integrated chain. Mexico has challenges that it hasn't tackled effectively in terms of what kind of industrial policy it needs to enhance domestic production in Mexico. The new USMCA provisions are a big tool that can help in that regard, but that's a feature that goes beyond current tensions and the current competitive dynamics between the US and China, and the reconfiguration of trade flows, particularly after the pandemic. The new feature has to do with the dramatic increase in Chinese car exports, both traditional and EVs, as part of a global trend that we can very clearly see in Europe and Mexico, where out of nowhere, basically over the last 2 or 3 years, Chinese cars now represent over 10% of our domestic market. China has overtaken Japan as the world's leading car exporter. It's important to keep in mind, and I will come back to this, that there are no Chinese car exports from Mexico to China because of regulatory issues, and of course, very high tariffs for China to enter the US market, which are at the very least, I think, at about 25% tariff. So these two dynamics are coming to a head as the global economy recovers, especially with this feature of Chinese overcapacity, not only in cars, but in various sectors. I think that the expectations were that the Chinese economy, after the severe shutdown that was implemented by the government, was removed. Chinese consumers did not react or have not reacted as dynamically as expected. Growth expectations have slowed down in the Chinese market. I think the latest target is 5%. There's significant strains on the domestic economy, particularly in the real estate market in China. So there's a lot of stuff, a lot of goods that are being directed to international markets. The other non-economic side of the equation that I will highlight is, of course, the fentanyl issue, which is significant in the political radar of the US because of a tremendous impact it has had in terms of overdoses in the US. It is a market that has adapted significantly. I remember, for example, I was the Undersecretary of Foreign Affairs in the first two and a half years of this administration. We were still seeing a dynamic in terms of fentanyl flows that was more concentrated on direct shipments from China to the US after the breakdown by post or by courier services after the breakdown of the Obama era agreements during the Trump administration. And very quickly with the pandemic, the formula began to change where we saw significant increases in precursor exports from China to Mexico, and then manufacturing and traffic to the US market. So it became a very sensitive issue in which the triangular dimension of the US-Mexico-China relationship came to a head. I'll mention a little bit about what was discussed in San Francisco individually with China by the three presidents, but in a way that merges the way we're approaching this very difficult issue, which is going to be top of mind, particularly on the US side as we head toward the November elections. So what situation is Mexico facing right now? In general terms, what Mexico needs to do is to strike a balance between its own national interests in China with its North American dimension. And when I mention its North American dimension, you're speaking with someone who is absolutely convinced, and Tom knows this, and Alan knows this, that the key to Mexico's long-term productivity and competitiveness and economic development is within North America by strengthening the North American economic space. I think this applies both to Canada and to the United States. Sometimes it's not as top of mind as we would like it to be. And all these shifts are playing out in an electoral context, both in Mexico and in the United States. What do I mean by national interest? Well, of course, it's in Mexico's interest to foster legitimate trade and investment with what is soon going to be the world's #1 economy and a key export destination for Mexico. In that regard, we have similar interests to the US and Europe, for example, to secure a level playing field for our investments. Something that is also different from other emerging economies around the world and from Latin America is that big Mexican companies have significant investments in China. Mexican companies are in everything from industrial chemicals, software, auto parts, processed foods, a wide range of products that are now in the framework also of the regional free trade agreement among 15 economies in Asia that give Mexico simplified access to, other than China, 14 Asian economies. So it's a feature that is a key to our long-term economic interests in China. Another national interest, of course, is to foster productive investment that is WTO and USMCA compliant and that secures access to China's, as I mentioned, consumer market. And again, this is a challenge also faced by Europe. We have seen, for example, that Europe has a very difficult balancing act where it doesn't necessarily want to sign off fully onto the US geopolitical agenda, given its deeper dependence on China than the US has. And even with all the talk of decoupling and the shifts in supply chains, we have to keep in mind that the U.S. has a significant investment footprint in China, and that regardless of the downturn in certain kinds of investment and trade flows, it's still a major, highly integrated bilateral trading market. So it's important to keep in mind. And in this regard, Mexico can't subtract itself from geopolitical dynamics and must do this through intelligent diplomacy that includes convergence with the U.S. and North America on the most sensitive issues, from semiconductors and potential dual-use technologies to critical minerals. We saw, for example, that some of President Biden's signature legislative initiatives, the IRA and the CHIPS Act, have provisions that have incentives for North America. And this is because of a combination of common sense on the political side in the U.S., good strategic work by the congressional shops of Mexico and Canada in the U.S. Congress as well, a realization that there's a North American dimension to the U.S. competitiveness strategy vis-a-vis China. So that's also an important factor to keep in mind. And some of these provisions, of course, have raised flags and some discomfort among other U.S. important trading partners, for example, the European Union countries and the South Koreans. So it's a competitive advantage that Mexico and Canada as well need to capitalize upon and look at strategically. And this is another feature that also applies to the U.S. when addressing the China dimension, is that we both have a big Achilles heel in terms of the tyranny of our political calendars. 4 years in the case of the U.S., 6 years in the case of Mexico, and it's very difficult to find common denominators, to build common ground on what the long-term strategic pathways toward our global competitiveness needs. It's very difficult. And of course, China is much more effective at this because of the nature of its political system, the way its economy works, and because of the concentration of power in Xi Jinping's third term, which, as I said before, the evolution of Xi Jinping is another key feature in this time that he has been China's leader. So how to reconcile these national interests vis-a-vis China? Our Asian projection, remember that Mexico is also a key player in the Asian economy, both in Southeast Asia and Northeast Asia as well, increasingly with India, while ensuring convergence with the U.S. on the key issues and the key sensitivities that are not going to go away and could get worse after elections in Washington. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen visited Mexico last December. She and the Mexican finance minister, her counterpart, announced conversations that would lead to an agreement on investment screening for national security considerations. There was no specific timeline given, but it's a priority for Washington, not only for Secretary Yellen in this kind of balancing act that the administration is itself in the midst of ensuring that there is bandwidth in terms of political engagement with China and stabilizing dialogue in a very complex and very varied strategic, economic, military, security environment with Beijing. And of course, uncertainty is the key given the upcoming elections, both in the U.S. and in Mexico, even though the basic lines of continuity vis-a-vis engagement with China are likely to continue. We know from experience that there's a difference, at least in style over substance, even if some of the policies from Washington have remained. We saw, for example, and it applied to engagement with Mexico as well, a more unilateralist, confrontational approach to dealing with global partners by the US. We had to scramble to safeguard all the ground that we had gained on various fronts, even in the context of the suspension of various formal mechanisms for bilateral and trilateral dialogue. This also happened with China, and that's why the meeting in San Francisco was so important. And there was incredible, those of you, of course, many of you are in the US administration, it took incredible diplomatic and political legwork to make sure that that meeting in San Francisco went well. There were 3 meetings that were important, not just the Biden-Xi meeting, but also the Biden-Lopez Obrador meeting, the Lopez Obrador-Xi Jinping meeting. On fentanyl, for example, Mexico had taken the lead in establishing a bilateral dialogue on fentanyl, and by sending senior officials from the various ministries and the Attorney General in Mexico to formalize the establishment of this agreement. And later in San Francisco, the U.S. formalized its own mechanism with China. That was followed by a visit to Beijing that was hosted by Ambassador Burns to reactivate this engagement that is very necessary to address a very, very complicated and difficult issue, which I hope, like other mechanisms, survives regardless of electoral scenarios in the US. Now, what was Mexico do in terms of this balancing act, for example, on national investment screening for national security reasons? I would say, and I'm not currently a government official, as you know, I'm on leave from the Foreign Service right now, as Tom mentioned in his introduction. We have to try to ensure that the bandwidth of the sensitive issues is as narrow as possible. This has been also a stated objective that has been mentioned both by Secretary Yellen and Commerce Secretary Raimondo, in the sense that there's a wide range of legitimate and welcome trade and investment with China. We have to make sure that we defend Mexico's interest in that dynamic, to make sure that those sensitive issues are as narrow as possible, that it can be dealt with in as constructive a way as is possible. The trick now is, again, we're in an electoral calendar, so we have to try to navigate how these legitimate national security concerns on a specific set of issues doesn't dovetail with protectionist tendencies in the US, particularly from the congressional front in Washington. We have seen, for example, that the Biden administration has a very difficult balancing act in terms of tightening the screws on some of these issues. Recently, there have been investigations that have been launched, for example, on smart cars, on components that imply data storage in China, and that is a sensitive issue that somehow has to do with the dynamics that we're seeing here on electric vehicles, for example. There's a lot of noise on the cranes that are used in major US ports. 80% of them are Chinese. You can't wean yourself from that from a short-term political strategy. We have seen congressional initiatives, mostly on the Republican side in the House of Representatives, with bipartisan support, at least at the committee level, on talking about, for example, significantly increasing potential exports, Chinese exports to the US market, regardless of where they are manufactured. And there have been some statements in the last couple of days from Donald Trump, some other comments on immigration and on the political process have taken the headlines. But he also said that he would establish or impose a 100% tariff on Chinese cars
from Mexico. So these things are on his radar, and we have to keep in mind that USMCA is up for a review in 2026, which was one of the concessions that were made by Canada and Mexico to get USMCA across the line. So it's a very difficult pathway for us to navigate in the coming months because, of course, it is in our national interest to ensure that legitimate productive investment from all quarters can grow and can thrive without, political or other kind of subjective constraints. I think the common denominator going forward is uncertainty in potential Trump scenario. As I said, we would see at the very least a significant change in style and approach. Before his most recent remarks, he had talked about imposing a 10% global tariff on all imports that go to the United States, regardless of where they come from. My sense up to now had been that Donald Trump sees in many ways USMCA as his baby. He demonstrated that he could be tough, that he could make an ultimatum to Canada and Mexico, bring them to the table and negotiate a better deal. So there was a little bit of wiggle room in terms of scenarios in which Mexico and Canada could potentially be in a kind of bubble from those kinds of policy initiatives. But regardless of electoral outcomes in the US, there is going to be significant tariff pressures. We're already seeing noise, for example, on triangulation of of import steel exports from Mexico to China, with accusations on triangulation from China that Mexico has denied very strongly, that both industry and the Mexican Ministry of Economy. So there's a potential red flag there on a specific product that is not going to go away in the short term, and that we have to be on the lookout for. So what is the trick? What is the magic formula? And as we head toward the end, speaking hopefully not boringly to you for 40 minutes, the trick that I think applies in many ways to the US is sustained engagement with China. This does not mean in any way that there has to be 100% agreement on anything. There are frictions involved anytime that there are national interests and divergences involved. This is going to happen. There are stakes for all players. We need to have a clear-eyed view of priorities, and I highlighted some of them when I mentioned what is our national interest. There has to be a good balance between bilateral and geostrategic interests. We have seen, for example, Mexico has in a way had a lower international profile during the last 5 years, but this doesn't change the reality that we are a highly integrated country into the global economy, more so than our Latin American neighbors and partners, not just in terms of manufacturing. Over 70% of global tourists to Latin America and the Caribbean go to Mexico. We have a unique economic footprint with the United States. We are the world's 12th or 13th largest economy, a G20 member that needs to navigate an evolving geopolitical situation, and this has always been a challenge. I was the Sherpa for the G20 during the summits that were held during Brazilian President Bolsonaro's term and during Donald Trump's presidency, where there was significant pressure on key partners in the G20, for example, not to have even a mention of anything related of things to like climate change or even gender equality in G20 approaches, let alone addressing the immigration issue, which is another issue that is top of mind, as Alan knows very well, in the political agenda of the US as we head into the election. Then, of course, strict enforcement of Mexican legislation increasing or strengthening existing legislation if that is necessary to avoid, illicit trade, triangulation, and of course, strict compliance with WTO and USMCA provisions, including on automotive rules of origin. I don't think we have calm waters ahead. I think there's a lot of red flags along the way. We're seeing, I think it's always easy to say in the time that we're working in that situations that we face are unprecedented, but I do think we're here in the middle of major shifts in the geopolitical playing field, where we have a very uneasy interaction between unresolved 20th century issues, and Ukraine and the Middle East are the best examples, and the bigger picture in terms of what is happening in terms of the rearrangement of the balance of power at the global level, which is more fragmented with a lot of other players with different views in the game. I think Mexico's strengths lie both in this global insertion that has been developed over the last 30 years, with a very clear-headed realization that a lot of our national interests are inexorably linked to North American and US dynamics. I'll close just with one example. There's been a lot of attention on the primaries in the US as both parties head to their nominations of their respective candidates in this summer's political conventions. There was a primary in South Carolina. South Carolina is, we're a big trading partner with that state. About 70,000 jobs in South Carolina depend on trade with Mexico. And South Carolina buys more from us than Brazil or Argentina or Peru or Colombia or Chile. And I'm not even mentioning Texas, which is Mexico's largest trading partner, and many of you are probably there, and those affiliated with the university know this very well. A very deep interdependence where we have a complex network of interests that we have to safeguard, develop, and grow. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Julian. That was an absolutely fantastic, wide-ranging, but also quite deep look into the relationship between China and North America, and China and Mexico. I'd encourage everyone to ask questions. Please feel free to put those into the chat if you would like, or you can raise your hand, and I should be able to call on you. Do we have anyone who would like to get things started, or if not, I will jump in while we let you all gather your thoughts. Alan or Greg, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Just one quick thank you. It was wonderful. I was skeptical how you could go from 1972 to the present, but you did it, and that was fantastic. Just real quickly, saw a report the other day that container trade between China and Mexico has really expanded in the last few years, where there was I think a 38, almost 40% increase. And then even month over month for January 23 to 24, it was 100% increase. Is there a sense that that's due to issues with logistics, where the west coast of U.S. ports are somehow bound up, or is it more a matter of just legitimate trade activity that's really starting to be fostered as the kind of the effects of COVID wear off?
Do you want to take another question, Tom? Do you want me to answer, Greg? How do you want to do this?
As you'd like. I see Alan, I think, has his microphone off. Alan, did you want to add a question as well?
I wanted to take up the issue of the triangulation, and first agreed, Julian, this was a tour de force. Thank you very much. So the USMCA actually was the source of what is now very much a regulatory issue in the United States with regard to Uyghur forced labor and the entire forced labor situation in primarily in Chinese supply chains. And I wanted you to comment, if you would, on the interaction, the potential interaction between forced labor enforcement and the degree of nearshoring. While you put it in proper perspective, there has been an enormous increase in the investment of Chinese suppliers in Chihuahua, particularly in Nuevo León. And what we haven't seen, though, is the visibility in those Chinese supply chains that I think remain a large issue in the triangulation of future trading relationships. That is to say that the impression that I can't currently document is that many Chinese suppliers continue to have big Xinjiang issues and other forced labor issues that ultimately would affect exports from Mexico to the United States. And I wanted to get your comment on that, if I might.
I think that should be enough to keep you busy, Julian.
Yeah, well, first on container trade, Greg's question. I think it's a mixture of factors. I think we're seeing, for example, one, pandemic backlogs that are resuming their normal flow. There was significant strain on Mexico's Pacific ports. Our infrastructure development has not kept up at the speed that it should in terms of our long-term approach. This is something that other ports in the Pacific coast of the U.S. are facing as well, in Long Beach and farther up to the Pacific Northwest. There is the issue of course, the fact that as the Mexican economy has picked up so significantly in terms of its export flows, particularly to the U.S., that the inputs on some of those key manufacturers also see a natural rise. It's still a small proportion in terms of the overall amount of Mexican exports, to the U.S., 400 billion versus 8 or 9 billion, but that's also a factor. I think that whether we like it or not, and this goes to the point of saturation, our North American port structure has a North American DNA. They operate almost instinctively in terms of pressure points and redirections from Prince Rupert in British Columbia down to Vancouver and down to the southern coast of the US and the Pacific ports in Mexico. That's why one of the big gaps that I always harp upon is that there should be a more strategic Pacific ports dialogue in terms of our North American agenda. That's something that we need to do more assertively. The other thing has to do with overcapacity. A lot of those containers are coming in with Chinese cars and exports of components, which is, of course, the most highly integrated part of the North American trading partners. And I might say that a lot of those Chinese cars that are coming into Mexico, there's some new players that are significantly expanding exports to Mexico, are American brands. GM is the largest brand that is certain models that are imported for the Mexican market. Most of Mexican production is for the North American market. That's something that should be kept in mind as well. At various points, for example, when I talked about Latin American exports to China, soybeans, beef, copper, minerals, that kind of thing, our biggest export, other than a time when we had a blip of a spike in copper exports to China during the pandemic and just before the pandemic, our biggest export to China is cars and auto parts, because certain Mexican-built models that are sold in China are manufactured in Mexico. So it's a very globally integrated kind of pattern. On triangulation, Alan, a lot of this I haven't done any hard research on this, but just from my experience and seeing the profile of the exports, most of the Chinese investment that is coming in, that has been coming in to Mexico, has been in the electronics and in the auto parts sector. There have been big mergers and acquisitions. For example, big Chinese players have acquired Japanese companies like Sharp, who was a significant flat screen manufacturer in Mexico. Hisense, Haier, those of you who are familiar with Chinese appliances and electronic brands. A lot of money is coming into that beyond the auto sector. The auto sector investment and a lot of the electronic components tend to be origin centered in China from Northeast China, some toward the Pearl River Delta, Shanghai down to Guangzhou. Most of the concerns, which is a flag that we should be on the lookout for, on forced labor on Xinjiang, all has to do with textiles and footwear. That has more to do with not stuff that is made in Mexico, but the lookout that we should have out for imports of finished products of those goods. And of course, the labor issues have gained prominence in the new USMCA in terms of compliance with labor rights. So it's also something that we should keep in mind as we have a more fine-grained view of the profile of what we're importing from China and what is being manufactured by Chinese investment or Chinese companies in Mexico. So it should be on the radar. I don't think it's a big red flag right now. It's something, for example, that the US government hasn't flagged, but some manufacturers associations have, and they're very much in sync with their Mexican counterparts, for example, on packages that are exported to the US and Mexico through digital trade. Shine, Temu, you buy very cheap, fast fashion clothing and textile products from Chinese companies. There's a de minimis rule that is $800 in the US. It's lower in Mexico, so there's some legislative pressure to change those thresholds or to at the very least increase customs supervision in the Canada, US, and Mexico to make sure that there's no undervaluing of those packages and also as to the labor that was used to make those products.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Julian. And I'm very glad that you mentioned the issue of North American infrastructure, because next month we'll be talking about North American infrastructure in this seminar. So it will be a great way to continue that point. If we don't have any other questions, then I'd like to ask one closing question, which is that I want to give you an opportunity perhaps to reflect on what might be the main opportunities for Mexico in this shifting panorama that you've outlined? Where and in what specific sectors might Mexico be able to take advantage of what seems likely to be continued tensions on trade between the United States and China? We see, as you've outlined, an increase in Mexican exports to the United States, but looking forward a little bit, where does this perhaps offer greater medium and longer term opportunities for Mexico to sort of climb the global production value chain in a sense?
Sometimes we're the last to realize the depth and breadth of our competitive advantages globally and in North America. We like to beat ourselves sometimes with a very outdated focus on things. We have a leg up, for example, from other Latin American players in terms of adding value to our exports. It's not optimal, but it's certainly better than what we're seeing in South America and in more closed economies. We have very open economies like Chile's, who has very little value added in their exports to China, and a very big industrial economy like Brazil, but that in many ways is like the Mexican economy was in the 1970s, very much geared toward domestic markets. So what we're seeing now in terms of the reconfiguration of supply chains globally and in North America is a unique opportunity that we can't lose. A lot of the opportunities it's going to take, if we have a far-reaching approach to adding value and to insert ourselves in some of the most high-end segments of production. For example, semiconductors are a big objective. Those sophisticated aspects that Asia has been very successful at doing, we're not going to see the benefits of things that we do now in the short or medium term. Those are long-term investments in our position. We are going to see lower hanging fruit in lower ends of those kinds of components and in the manufacturing and productive investment in Mexico. And that has to do with having an intelligent investment promotion strategy toward Asia, toward Europe, toward the United States. We're not competing in some ways with other countries. We're competing with Louisiana, or we're competing with Georgia. So we need to have a very fine-grained view of investment patterns in the U.S. because real competitors are there, and the states are taking the lead to sort of leverage U.S. stimulus in terms of incentives and facilities to attract investment. There's a lot of work that we need to do internally, vis-a-vis our regulatory framework, vis-a-vis infrastructure, which you have mentioned. I think the wisest investment that Mexico can make is in its, not a 21st century border, on which I've worked with Alan before, but a 23rd century border. Those kinds of investments are going to be very important, and that give us a very unique opportunity. And resolving our internal challenges. There's polarization in Mexico, just like there is in the US and other places around the world. How to find those basic decisions that we need on energy supplies, on water issues, on the nuts and bolts of the fuel that creates an ecosystem that is attractive beyond geopolitics. And I think we're in a very, very good position looking ahead if we do our homework and if we get it right. Otherwise, we're just going to be navigating or reaping the benefits of inertia, which is there and we should capitalize upon, but we should think more and more strategically about these issues.
Thank you so much, Julian. This has been an absolute pleasure to listen to and benefit from your wide-ranging expertise. On behalf of Greg and the Center, we really want to express our appreciation. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you to everyone in the audience as well. With that,
thanks everyone. It's a pleasure to join you.
Thank you so much. We'll go ahead and close things. We've gone just a bit past the hour, unless you have a final word, Greg.
None, but again, echo the thanks. Thank you so much. Wonderful. Have a good day, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Goodbye.